Okay, everyone, welcome back to Cultural Transformations, Religion, and Science. We're going to look at a new way of thinking, the birth of modern science. So let's start with a new way of thinking. The scientific revolution was an intellectual and cultural transformation that occurred between the mid-16th and early 18th century. It was based on careful observations, controlled experiments, and formulation of general laws to explain the world. And creators of the movement saw themselves as making a radical departure from earlier beliefs. And the scientific revolution was vastly significant. It fundamentally altered ideas about the place of the humankind within the cosmos. It challenged ancient social hierarchies and political systems. It also was used to legitimize racial and gender inequality. And by the 20th century, science had become the chief symbol of modernity around the world. All right, the question of origins. Why Europe? Okay, the Islamic world was the most scientifically advanced realm from the period 800 to 1400. And China's technological accomplishments and economic growth were unmatched for several centuries after the millennium. But European conditions were uniquely favorable to the rise of science. The evolution of a legal system that guaranteed some independence for a variety of institutions by the 12th and 13th centuries. And the idea of the corporation, a collective group treated as a legal unit with certain rights. And the autonomy of universities. Coming out of the Middle Ages, Europe was a fragmented but reinvigorated civilization with many independent institutions. Society was organized into collective groups with various rights and privileges, as well as forms of self-regulation. And European universities were autonomous, providing self-governments and freedom from church and state authorities. And so, but things are a little different in the Islamic world. Science remained mostly outside of the system of higher education, and Chinese authorities did not permit independent institutions of higher learning. So, in the Chinese education system focused on preparing for civil service exams, as opposed to the scientific world, and there was an emphasis on classical Confucian texts. In contrast to the autonomous European universities, the schools of the Islamic world were madrasas, where the Quran might be viewed as the only source of wisdom and philosophy, and natural science might be viewed with skepticism. And as mastery of the Confucian canon was crucial for entry into the Chinese state bureaucracy, education consisted of preparation for those rigid civil service examinations, and the state did not allow independent institutions of higher learning. Now, Western Europe could draw on the knowledge of other cultures. The 16th through 18th centuries, Europeans were at the center of a massive new information exchange. There was a tidal wave of knowledge that shook up the old ways of thinking, and explosions of uncertainty and skepticism allowed modern science to emerge as intellectual thinkers began to question their natural environment and the world around them. And the Reformation contributed by challenging authority, encouraging mass literacy, and affirming secular professions. So we see this knowledge from other cultures. Europeans gained access to Greek, Arab, and other texts that offered knowledge from outside cultures. And after 1500, Europeans gained insight from various overseas adventures to the New World and the Indian Ocean basin. So knowledge from outside of Europe shook up the whole existing bodies of knowledge and led to a critical view of inherited certainties and traditions. Now, the European view of the world before the scientific revolution, a little bit different. It was a dominant, educated European view, and it derived from Aristotle and Ptolemy. The Earth is stationary at the center of the universe, and the universe, it's a universe of divine purpose. And the Catholic Church supported the classic model of the universe that put the Earth at the center. And this 2nd century idea came from the work of Ptolemy. However, there was initial breakthrough by Nicholas Copernicus on the revolutions of the heavenly spheres in 1543 that promoted the view that the Earth and the planets revolved around the sun. So this is the development of the heliocentric theory. And it wasn't just Copernicus, it was him and a few others. And they built on Copernicus's insight. Some argued that there were other inhabited worlds. Johannes Kepler demonstrated the elliptical orbits of the planets, and Galileo Galilei developed a highly improved telescope to confirm the planetary motion set forth by Copernicus's insight, where the planets revolved around the sun. In the 16th century, this series of Europeans took detailed measurements of the movement of the stars and planets and proved that the Earth was not at the center of the universe, but rather one of the many planets that revolved around the sun. And the church was extremely hostile to such revisionism, as it challenged papal authority and implied that the Earth and humanity were not so special. And Galileo was forced to recant his ideas, and Giordano Bruno was burned at the stake in 1600 for such radical ideas. Now, Sir Isaac Newton was the apogee of the scientific revolution. He formulated laws of motion and mechanics that were new, and the central concept that he developed of the universal law of gravitation. And he said that natural laws govern both the micro and the macrocosms. And one of the greatest figures of the scientific revolution was Isaac Newton. He developed the concept of universal gravitation and showed that mathematics could describe all the forces of the natural world. And his work promoted the idea that the world had certain governing laws and humans could discover these principles. And the Newtonian universe was knowable and provable using mathematics. Now, by Newton's death, educated Europeans had a fundamentally different view of the physical universe. Not propelled by angels and spirits, but functioned according to mathematical principles, and by the machine of the universe is self-regulating. And knowledge of the universe can be obtained through reason. And the human body became less mysterious. And the leaders of the scientific revolution were almost entirely male. There are very few aristocratic women that participated informally in scientific networks of male relatives. An accommodating faith and tradition with science. And that's what we see here. Despite, a few exceptions, traditional gender barriers to educating European women ensured that men dominated the scientific revolution. While the church did not like to see its authority undermined, many scientists, such as Newton, were faithful Christians who saw the hand of God behind the making of the knowable universe. Importantly, none of the early scientists rejected Christianity or even espoused atheism. But as I mentioned earlier, the Catholic Church was strenuously opposed to a lot of these new ways of thinking. I mentioned earlier they burned Giordano Bruno in 1600 for proclaiming an infinite universe. Galileo was forced to renounce his belief that the Earth moved around in orbit and rotated on its axis. But like I said, no early scientists actually rejected Christianity. Now, let's talk about science and enlightenment. Now, the scientific revolution slowly reached a wider European audience. A scientific approach to knowledge was applied to all human affairs, done by Adam Smith, who formulated economic laws, and people believe that scientific development would bring enlightenment to humankind. Immanuel Kant defined enlightenment as a daring to know concept, and Enlightenment thinkers believed that knowledge could transform human society. It tended to be satirical, critical, and hostile to established authorities. They attacked arbitrary government, divine right, and aristocratic privilege. And John Locke, a very important early political thinker, articulated the ideas of a constitutional government and the natural rights of man. So each of these key Enlightenment figures saw the world as understanding, or as an understandable and perfectible once humans figured out the rules that govern society. Much of the Enlightenment thought attacked established religion. The Treatise on Toleration by Voltaire attacked organized religion. Many thinkers were deists. The belief in a remote deity who created the world but doesn't really intervene. And some were even pantheists, equated God and nature. And they even regarded religion as a fraud. There were some that believed that way. But, as these humans figured out the rules that govern society and economics and morality, education and embracing reason, people could become enlightened. Let's talk about the role of women in society and their education. There were also topics of debate. Enlightenment thinkers were influenced by growing global awareness. And the central theme of the Enlightenment was the idea of progress. Right? Some thinkers reacted against too much reliance on human reason. Jean-Jacques Rousseau argued for immersion in nature rather than book learning. And the Romantic movement appealed to emotion and imagination as opposed to just reason and learning. And there were religious awakenings that made an immense emotional appeal to the masses. So despite various progressive ideas about social equality and a common rejection of aristocratic privilege, men dominated the Enlightenment. And the movement took a dim view of education for women. That said, there were women who played key roles in hosting Parisian salons, a few who were published in the Encyclopedia, and intellectuals such as Mary Wollstonecraft, who criticized the patriarchal and misogynist ideas of Rousseau and others. Deism, like I said earlier, the belief in a God that created the world and left the world to run its course and didn't intervene, was a common spiritual idea of the Enlightenment. It was not atheism, but it specifically rejected the idea a God that intervened in human affairs and questioned the need for an institutionalized religion. Pantheism viewed God or gods as being one with nature and had even less use of rituals, sacred texts, or clergy. And partially in reaction to a perceived godlessness in the Enlightenment, a Protestant religious awakening spread throughout the northwestern Europe and North America in the 18th and 19th centuries. And Romanticism also embodied, like I said, a reaction to science as being cold and without feeling and deeper spiritual truths. So it had an immense emotional appeal. Let's look ahead at science in the 19th century. Modern science was cumulative and self-critical. In the 19th century, science was applied to new sorts of inquiry in some ways. It undermined Enlightenment assumptions. Charles Darwin argued that all of life was in flux, and Karl Marx presented human history as a process of change and struggle, and Sigmund Freud cast doubt on human rationality. Charles Darwin, a biologist that argued that life was constantly changing and evolving. All forms of life were in constant struggle with each other over resources, and those that lost the struggle could go extinct. And this is expressed in his books, The Origin of Species and the Development of Man. And they were just as revolutionary as Nicholas Copernicus's work. Karl Marx, like Darwin, Marx saw human history as a constant struggle, but this was between the classes. Marx saw his description of the evolution of human society as scientific because he based it upon research and observation. Both Darwin and Marx emphasized conflict and struggle, as opposed to previous scholars who optimistically saw reason as leading to peace and progress. And Sigmund Freud, at the dawn of the 20th century, Freud's unsettling work about human rationality really probed the human unconscious and noted that there were primal urges of sexuality and aggression that drove many humans. And this stood in sharp contrast to the Enlightenment's emphasis on rationality. All right, European science beyond the West. Science became the most widely desired product of European culture. Chinese had selected interests in the Jesuits' teachings, most interested in astronomy and mathematics, and European science had substantial impact on the Chinese Caojing movement. The telescope was found to be a useful tool in China, Mughal India, the Ottoman Empire, but it failed to become a discovery machine outside of Europe. And as China, India, Japan, and the Ottoman Empire had strong states and cultural systems, there was relatively little interest in adopting foreign ways of thinking. Now, Chinese scholars found European astronomy and map making rather useful. The Caozhou movement that drew much knowledge of the natural world and mathematics from contact with Europeans. And the Jesuits lost much faith in China after 1760 when it was discovered that they had hid the Copernican model of the universe out of loyalty to church doctrine. And in Japan, only the Dutch could visit the islands, and they were limited to Nagasaki. And those Japanese scholars who did have contact with the Dutch learned from various European texts on medicine and astronomy and geography and proved to be quite useful. And those important books were allowed starting in 1720. And there was a small group of Japanese scholars that were interested in those Western texts, and even anatomical studies in particular. Now, the Ottoman Empire chose not to translate major European scientific works. The Ottoman scholars were only interested in ideas of practical utility, maps, calendars, things of that nature. And the Islamic educational system was conservative and made it hard for theoretical science to do well. Now, while the revelations of the Copernican solar system did not disturb the rich tradition of Muslim astronomy, many works of Western scholars were not translated. While practical knowledge was welcome, there were various traditions and superstitions and cultural prejudices that blocked the widespread acceptance of Western science. And that is the conclusion of chapter 15. The cultural transformations. I will see you guys for chapter 16, which is the beginning of Unit 5 or Part 5, and we'll look at the Atlantic revolutions. Oh yeah, I will post a video about the visual sources from chapter 15. Thanks.